Oh my God, those yawns like overtook me. I don't know what happened. Like all of a sudden I got sleepy. I went over, took a nap, and like I lost like I don't know how much of my life. Man, those yawns. You gotta watch out for those yawns when you go. So back to body cameras, right? So when you have this body worn camera that starts this magic, word activation, right? We're thinking that there's something called a Hawthorne effect, where people are watching, or people are otherwise deterred from their behavior, right? And so the idea being is that we're going to be able to limit misconduct because we know officers are being watched, and that this is a form of accountability, right? And so important things to remember, right, is that this is intended to be like an oversight function, right? So we're supposed to have this oversight ability. And body worn cameras became like a pretty like popular item, right? Because the federal government was like shoving money at police departments to adopt this technology without really like a lot of like evidence to look at their efficacy or how they would work, right? Because when you think about what the cost of it is, right? Like the cameras are relatively cheap. But the real cost associated with it, right, is video storage. Because if you think about, an officer like can't like have the camera rolling each like 24/7 and then have it uploaded. It's like because the amount of files that are related to it per officer per shift, right, is incredible, right? It's a huge amount. So you have to try to like mitigate it by doing like only encounters, with the public, right? So, and under certain conditions, right? There's all kinds of like different rules and policies and regulations for it, right? And it's just like impractical to have the camera running all the time and to save that storage, right? Because if you consider like storage has to be kept in case it's like used in evidentiary hearings, and you have to make decisions about how long you keep that kind of video storage. The cost of like keeping it in house. How do you train? At what point do you destroy it, right? So all that is important to encounter, right? And so when you consider like the cost of it, right? I mean, like maybe it feels better because like settlements decrease or there's less complaints, but it's an outlandish cost, right? And so it really necessitates looking at like if we does this actually get the outcomes that we want, right? Because it's incredibly expensive. What we end up finding, right, is that if we look at like typical complaints, in this case, like, pretty minor kind of stuff, right? There is some evidence that, the use of body-worn cameras, which I'm calling BWC, are associated with a reduction in complaints. But an important consideration, right, is that this is only for like minor behavior, which again is like the bulk of most complaints. Most people, when they complain, think, officer, was professionally discourteous. And there's some, a lot of interpretation about what is it is not discourteous and like what is, acceptable or is not, right? So you look at those kinds of, complaints, right? So there is less of that, right? But this is important because it could lead to like, a better, idea of police legitimacy. And we think that, police are better off. We have better trust and confidence in their ability to do their job. We're more likely to defer to their orders. That's what I mean by police legitimacy. But we start looking at stuff like use of force and maybe like more serious or maybe like stops and searches, other instances of police proactivity, right? So things that officers are doing, right? There's like pretty weak evidence for use of force changes, which I'm marking with a triangle. And there's like a temporary effect with stops and searches, right, where we see that like when as officers adjust to like wearing the camera, they're a little bit fearful of like what could be seen, but as they get adjusted to it, and then they realize that the camera can help insulate them from any kind of accusation because there's a record of it, right? There tends to be, like an effect of where like that they over time they re-engage, right? So any kind of temporary effect happens, right? If we think about like the complaint thing, you know, from like a second ago, one aspect to consider, right, is that maybe civilians um, are maybe cowed or afraid to complain because of how that they might look at on camera. So they, rather than maybe file a complaint when they otherwise would, they're afraid of what they might look like or what the officer might look like, right? So there could be less complaints, not because like encounters are better, but because people are just like afraid of what they might see on video, right? So it may not actually be the process of what we're actually seeing, right? So it's something like worth consideration on that kind of point. But if we look at like the gains that are for it, right, where there is like this change in community, we have this better recording, right? Something that was could have been seen, but was kind of expected, right? Is that the police actually, right, have better conviction outcomes now because it was in this because now there's a record to back up their testimony. And if you see it on camera, to support whatever you wrote in your report, right, it's much more convincing because people can see it with their own eyes, right? I mean, so because the camera is another source of evidence. So in some ways, right, the intended effect was to like curb misconduct. And what has ended up happening, right, is that there's been a shift in like the perceived certainty of like going to jail or going to prison if you're caught. And so that aspect of it has helped like trial outcomes for police officers, quite a bit, right? But it's kind of interesting too because if we look at trial outcomes, what's interesting is that police now are in this era, right, where their testimony alone used to be trusted, is less trusted now because people are like, well, why don't you have the camera, right? And so if a police department doesn't have cameras, or if they don't have the ability to do that right, it can kind of be seen less trusted during trial. And when in the past they would have been deferred to, they would have been more seen as more trustworthy by a jury, taking their word at. They're kind of seen as less trusted during trial, and that may make some convictions harder, just because there's no video record and people have this expectation, um, that there should be a video, even though a police department may not be equipped to do it. So, the thing with body cameras, or body worn cameras, right, is that there's this huge promise that came in, and what we end up finding is that while there are maybe some gains in some places, right, there really isn't a lot of evidence to suggest that it's worth like the cost investment that comes in. What's happened now, right, is that police departments have to continue to increase it, right, and they have to maintain the funds because people expect them to have it, and so this complicates. Um, like any kind of defund the police kind of thing, because now there's this expectation that they have to pay for this, right? And the video storage costs prevent that. So, so when we think of this, right, we know all this is happening, and so it's an interesting little take in how a piece of technology that was intended to maybe like better policing it did in some ways, right, in terms of like trial outcomes, but in terms of like changing misbehavior, right, like it didn't really do so much. Part of that is also the fact that misbehavior by police, contrary to like depictions in the media or like excessive use of force, is rare. So, and because it's rare, right, it's hard to change a low base rate. So maybe wouldn't expect a huge change or a notable change in that, or if there is, it's pretty small because it's like pretty infrequent anyway. But that will conclude our session. So thank you all for listening.